I'm Scott Howe. I'm the Executive Director of ARF, the Animal Rescue Fund of the Hamptons in Waynescott. I live in Noyac. I've lived there 10 years, and I've been at ARF for 5 years. So in the spring of 2020, businesses were closing, but that wasn't something we could do. We had a shelter full of animals. And I knew that I couldn't care for the 100 animals here at ARF without a staff that was healthy as well. There was a real lack of information on how to keep our staff safe and what risks were okay and what risks might be jeopardizing ARF and our mission. There were really concerns over interstate transport of animals. There were travel restrictions being put in place, so quarantine requirements for people traveling outside of the area. And the majority of our rescues for dogs come from out of state. And some of those areas were the worst hit by the pandemic after New York. So it became a real concern about how do we continue our rescue transports and keep our staff safe. How could we safely conduct adoptions during the pandemic to let people meet their animals and potentially take them home, find their forever homes? But yet, how do we keep our staff safe and also the general public safe? We closed the shelter to adoptions except by appointment only as a way to limit the flow of people. But also, the challenge was fundraising. And how do you raise money during a pandemic, especially in the Hamptons when you can't have your summer events? And so in the spring of 2020, we were concerned about our whole calendar of events that raise a quarter to a third of our operating budget every year. We certainly saw increased demand, but not exponentially. The real challenge was not being able to meet the demand with supply because of the limitations on transport. So there were more adopters than there were animals. I think during the pandemic, we all came to rely on our animals as a source of comfort, as a source of routine, continuity. And certainly there were adopters who wanted that, and we heard from our adopters saying how much they valued their animals. I think with people finding themselves at home, having more time at home to spend with animals, people thought now maybe this is a good time to adopt a dog, or especially a puppy, because they have the time to devote to the animal's training. And so I do think that for many people, working at home became a good time to adopt. We saw some great long-term animals at ARF, some animals that have been overlooked by as many as 5 years, find their homes during the pandemic. So actually the scarcity of animals and also people having more time at home to devote to animals with behavior quirks, animals with strong personalities, or maybe some fear. And people were willing to give these animals a chance. And so we saw some really wonderful adoptions of animals who might not otherwise have been adopted had it not been for a pandemic. One thing early on in the pandemic, we called on volunteers to be fosters to help us move as many animals out of the shelter as we could. We were concerned that if our staff were to become ill and many of our staff had to quarantine, would we have enough staff to care for the animals in the building? And so for those animals who weren't finding adopters, we called on volunteers to foster them. We doubled our foster numbers and the animals in foster, and that's carried through to 2021 with kitten season, where at one point we had over 30 kittens out in foster. So instead of at the shelter, they were living with families, getting socialized until they were cleared medically for adoption. And then they would go from their foster home almost immediately into an adopter's home. So fosters are definitely something we'll rely on more in the future. I think the story that stands out to me was a call for help from Louisiana last summer after they'd been hit back-to-back by hurricanes and tropical storms. And there was a great need of rescue transport. There were shelters without power. And they were operating at capacity, and they needed to get animals to the Northeast where they could find homes. But how do you send staff for a 5-day round trip in the same transport vehicles in the middle of a pandemic to some of the regions of the country where the pandemic was raging? So we tested our staff here in the parking lot. They had their nasal swabs. They then became their own pod and traveled to Louisiana and came back and quarantined for 2 weeks afterwards. Because of course, all of this is pre-vaccine, and we were able to help these shelters when few other shelters could. And so I'll never forget the way my staff rose to the occasion at that time to help another shelter in need, and also put themselves at risk for the animals. And that's a great story. People were incredibly generous, and they, even without the galas and the big events, people still came through and supported us in some cases even more generously. Hey, Jada. Even more generously, even without all the fuss and fanfare of a typical summer gala season in the Hamptons. So we were very fortunate for that. I was always wearing an ARF cap. I worked here at ARF through the pandemic every day, just as I normally would, while many of our non-essential staff worked from home. There wasn't a time when I took off the hat, and the personal and the public merged together for me, and I think I felt the anxiety for the organization, for keeping my team safe, and above all for the animals, because it takes all of those three together to make ARF possible. I'm already censoring myself. I really can't say. There are so many. I can't narrow it down to just one.